not slowly, they have passed us by very fast, but we're slowly transitioning into our fall season. So welcome. We're honored that you are here. Tanse Michelle Nevadominiti Gasan Coacatus First Nation Oche. So I'm Cree, I'm Neheo Esqueo. I just introduced myself loosely in our Cree language. I live here in Amiskwaciwâskahikan, Edmonton Treaty 6 territory. So I think it's always important to acknowledge where we live. We acknowledge the ancestors, the people who've walked before us, who trailblazed those paths so we could live in a good way today. And I stand on so many people's shoulders who've walked before me, so I can stand proud of who I am. And I hope that you can as well. So welcome. You've joined us on this Wednesday afternoon. I hope it's beautiful wherever you are. It is hot here in Edmonton. I was telling the ladies earlier that it is the full moon. So Grandmother Moon is out tonight. And it is the super moon and the blue moon. So it's a pretty special evening. So for me, I always honor the full moon. I always honor the grandmother when she comes out in her power. This is a good opportunity for you just to take that time to reflect. Life is so busy. So it's important to take those moments for us to take that inward journey, reflect, like, what is it that I need to let go of? What is getting in my way of walking, the path that the Creator has set before me? So tonight it's all about letting go and offering that ceremony, offering good intentions and prayers. So I hope you have a good full moon tonight, wherever you are. All right, so let's get on with our session today, shall we? It is a good one. We're so honored that you are here. We got Sherry Jimmy with us. She's the Principal Consulting Strategy and Governance with us today. And the topic is, quite simply, but quite importantly, proposal writing. So today you're going to hear about understanding grants, proposals, 12-step process in writing proposals, best practices to be successful in securing proposal and grant writing. And I think that this is really, really important. Can Do is all about building the capacity. And this is one of the pieces that is really important for our nations, for our organizations. Maybe you're an entrepreneur, but tapping into those resources and those grants that may be available for us, but then to be able to do them in the right way, do them in a good way. So we're really honored that you're here with us this afternoon, Sherry. So just a little bit about our guest speaker. For the last 16 years, she has worked almost exclusively with First Nations communities to help us with governance, healthcare, economic development. Her background in municipal politics and governments has helped her to earn her stripes. One of her favorite things to hear is this: Sherry understands how our community works. And I think that is so important. So she is here. So that's just a little bit about our guest speaker today. We are honored that you've taken some time to spend with us and to share with us some of the knowledge, the good knowledge that all around proposal and grant writing. So thank you for being here. There will be time for questions at the end of her presentation, but if you have questions along the way, if you're like me, I got a short memory, so just put in the chat box and I will make sure I grab those questions and we will bring them to the floor. So welcome everyone. We're honored you're here. I just want to take a moment to give thanks to Creator for the gift of this day and the gift of this opportunity that we can meet all across the northern part of Turtle Island, just to learn and to grow and to build our capacity together. So thank you for being here. And Sherry, I'm passing this virtual mic off to you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and welcome everyone to this proposal and grant writing webinar. This is essentially a day-long program condensed into about 50 minutes. So let's call it a crash course. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat box, and I'll try to allow time at the end for a discussion. so that we can all learn from each other. I'm pleased to be bringing this webinar to you from Treaty 6 territory in north central Saskatchewan and homeland of the Métis. And as Michelle had said, I've got a fairly long history working with First Nation governments, actually dating back to being a health director about 30 years ago. So much of this presentation is built not only on textbook research and grant writing experience, but the school of hard knocks, as I put it, in terms of what I've learned along the way about writing proposals and grants for many of my clients. And I see by those of you on the screen that I'd like to say a fond hello to those of you that have been either past or present acquaintances, clients, co-workers of mine, and I certainly appreciate you joining this seminar. So just to give you a quick overview of the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to go very quickly through some definitions and terminology to establish a baseline of what we're talking about, and then jump into some context principles around proposal and grant writing. And then the real meat and potatoes of the presentation is around a 12-step process to applying for grants and writing proposals. And then to summarize at the end, I want to go over some best practices and key practices that take a look at proposal writing in a little bit different scenario than the 12 steps. And we'll do a quick summary and wrap up and leave some time for questions. So that's how the rest of the hour is going to proceed. So with that, jumping right into the definitions piece, when we talk about a grant, it's really the sum of money that is given by an organization or a government for a specific purpose. Generally, it doesn't have to be repaid, so the onus is on the grant writer to illustrate what the grant is going to be used for, to submit a plan or a purpose for the funding if it's required. And that the important thing to remember here is that when we're talking about getting grant funding from an organization or a government, there usually will be reporting requirements. So an example of a grant might be, say, the New Horizons for Seniors grant that you submit a proposal and a plan for, as well as a budget. A proposal, on the other hand, is really that plan or that documentation that's put forward for that funding request. You outline the specific project and activities within it, and hence the term proposal-based funding is very synonymous working with First Nations and the federal government, where they will often call something proposal-based funding. So proposal-based funding in our experience might be professional and institutional development funding and things of that nature. When we're talking about definitions, application is often used synonymously with a proposal. It's really the form or template that you use to apply for a grant or for a proposal. And an important point to remember in this definition piece is that there is an accountability segment, no matter whether we're calling it a grant, an application, or a proposal. Anytime we get money from an organization, and particularly a government, there is accountability standards. So that is usually denoted by a funding agreement or a funding amendment that will come to the organization that is receiving the grant or funding for the proposal. And within that funding agreement or amendment, there's going to be reporting requirements that you need to think about at the front end. How did you spend the money, and how you track how you spent it? What did you do? What were the activities? And the real important point here is that all of this is subject to audit. So we need to be cognizant of that at the front end and know what we are funded for after the proposal has been successful. So in order to be successful at a grant or proposal submission, there are two things to think about in the context. One is whether we're working in our no matter what capacity we're working in our First Nation communities or organizations, we're often asked to find funding, find the money to do something that leadership or management or the community needs to have done. So going about looking for grants and funding, I'm going to talk about very quickly, as well as responding to those calls for proposals, those emails, those advertisements that we get saying we're now accepting applications for. So jumping into the first one, when we're looking for funding to do something, I guess the first thing we probably do is we conduct an online search and look at some of the keywords that we are looking for funding to do. Maybe it's recreational activities, maybe it's something to prevent youth suicide. So once you find that grant or funding opportunity, it's important that it's matched as closely as possible to the community need. So you're going to, in most cases, always have a community need first. And then what is that grant or funding opportunity that best matches your community needs from your search? You may also have developed or have access to a database of grants and funding opportunities. And at Morris Interactive, we do keep a growing database of those opportunities. And you'll often see in your email box where we become knowledgeable about something that's being put out there. Most recently, family violence call for proposals. We will send that out in mass emails, which I'm sure are filling all of your inboxes already, but always keeping on top of what some of those opportunities are. And we try to communicate that as best we can. The other way is to talk to similar organizations and communities about how they got funding for certain things. I know when I travel a lot, particularly in northern Saskatchewan, I'll often see a van that says funding provided by. And that's an organization that I can go to and say, how did you get funding for that? To fund that, say, that community van or that youth center that you have in your community. So, you know, if you see something out there, don't be hesitant to talk to other organizations about how did you get funding for that? Most people are more than willing to share. It's not that much of a competitive environment that we keep that information to ourselves. So sharing that information with others about the successes that we've had. The flip side of that is actually responding to requests for proposals, or those RFPs, we call them. The important thing to remember here is that these requests for proposals probably only go to a few inboxes in your community or organization. So who are these directed to? Who might you need to contact in your organization to find out if they've been receiving any of these emails that say when some of these proposals are due? One of the more common things that I hear is, well, I didn't know that proposal call was open. I didn't get that email. And when we track it back, a lot of times there was someone in the organization that did get that information, but they were either too busy to deal with it or to hand it off, or didn't feel that it applied to them. So who are these RFP requests going to in your nation or your organization? Then taking a look at who would be responsible for completing that RFP and submitting that proposal. When are the deadlines to do it? If any of us have been in the capacity of a band manager or co-manager or even a health director, sometimes these things get sent to us with about 24 to 48 hours notice. So, you know, trying to beat the deadline and make sure we know as far in advance as possible when a proposal call has come out, and then looking at when it is due. The other thing to consider with requests for proposals is, how do you maximize opportunities? Is there a way to fund something in more than one way? Maybe one funding opportunity covers only certain things, but you can maximize the opportunity through a proposal to get funding from another source. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about stacking grants and contributions. A key thing to remember here is when you're replying to RFPs and putting in proposals, in most cases, I would say in the vast majority of cases, the need has to be linked to a broader vision and mission of the organization and something that is found in a plan somewhere, a strategic plan, an operating plan, a needs assessment. And how is this funding going to meet the needs of your community program or service? And how does that link to the broader context of the vision, mission, and objectives of that organization? So always being able to tie it together to the bigger picture. One-off proposals that don't link to the broader picture or a needs-based often are less successful. So let's jump into the 12-step process here in proposal writing that I would term, I guess, as some of the best practices moving forward. So the first is to define the focus of your project or proposal based on need. And how are you determining what that community need is? Once you determine what that community need is, how do you match that to the criteria for that funding proposal? And there will be criteria. So what is it that you want to accomplish? What are your goals and objectives? And most importantly, thinking in the early stages about how are you going to define success? If we get this funding, what is it going to look like? What is success going to look like? It's not just getting the funding approved, it's what is it that we're going to be able to accomplish with it. So linking your goals and objectives to not just the deliverables, but how you're going to define those outcomes, those indicators of success. The second best practice would be to start by gathering your core documents for easy reference. No matter what submission you are doing, an RFP, a request for proposals, a proposal plan, you're going to have to tell the funding agency a little bit about your organization. And I call it the About Us. And that comes directly, in most cases, from our websites. You know, what is on there that will tell the reader that we don't have to reinvent the wheel? What is our organization all about? What is our mission? What is our vision? Who are our key contact people? How does that vision, mission, and goals of your organization link back to the funding criteria for this submission? You also need to be aware of some of the other core documents that the funding agency that's receiving this proposal is asking for. Prior year's audits are something that's very common, especially with the federal government. And what standing is your organization in with the federal government? There's often a line item in some of these funding applications that says, do you owe any money to the federal government? Well, you as the proposal writer, do you know that? How do you get that information from your finance department? How do you get the prior year's audits if that's one of the things that you need? There's also a request often by the funding agency to submit supporting documentation, things that are going to put your project into that larger context. Thinking about where are you going to get a copy of the most recent strategic plan? Is there a comprehensive community plan? Is there other documentation that is going to assist the funding organization to understand how your need was determined and how it fits within that broader context? The third element here is to start by identifying the deadline for submission and basically working backwards. Develop a timetable to get that application or proposal completed so that this isn't 11th hour work. And many of you who have done proposal submissions know that inevitably it comes down to the 11th hour in many cases. Either we haven't had enough front end time to get everything done or put in, or it just sits on the corner of the desk until we absolutely have to get it done. Human nature. No criticism there at all. So it is a reality of how we operate. So know when that deadline is and try to develop a timetable working backwards. You also need to think at this stage of the proposal, how are you going to submit it? Is it an electronic submission? And is the portal going to close at exactly 11:59 Eastern Standard Time? Is a postmark required if you're using snail mail? And if so, I live in rural Saskatchewan, but the reality is, can we get it to the post office in time to get it date stamped? Because it's not a regular practice anymore in rural areas to date stamp submissions, and that may be a requirement if you're submitting it by mail. I know in this day and age, most things are done electronically. So the cognizant thing there is, if you're submitting or emailing, say, to a portal or to an organization, do they have a cutoff time? I know in our office, we had a very significant proposal due, and there was a technology problem that caused the submission to go in a few minutes after the deadline. And there was a lot of work that had to be done to convince the funding agency to accept it after that time. So know what the cutoff time is and know what that means in your, I'll say, language. If it says Eastern Standard Time, does that mean 2 hours earlier if you're in Western Canada, or 3 hours earlier? Those are things that you have to be very aware of. Read through the entire application and application guide from start to finish. The application, if it's online, isn't always easy to look at from start to finish. Sometimes you have to complete one page successfully before you can go on to the next page. So know and understand that. And in that case, it's even more important to read that application guide from start to finish. Make sure that you understand the eligibility criteria. Are you eligible to apply as an organization? Is this project eligible? Are the things that you need funding for eligible funding parameter within the eligible funding parameters? I could talk all day on some of those things, but I know we have to move on. Is there evaluation criteria that you need to think about? Because it's too late to start thinking about your evaluation criteria when you've only got an hour left to get the application in. So what is it that we're going to use to evaluate this? More and more, the funders are asking for evaluation criteria to be put into the application right at the front end, and for you, once you're approved, to be working to establish collecting the documentation so that you can provide that evaluation at the end and meet those criteria. It's important to determine in this step, is this funding a fit for your organization? Sometimes the answer is no. It's not always a fit. Maybe it isn't it doesn't fit within the geographic parameters or some other criteria. Maybe the cost benefit just isn't there. Maybe you're needing $250,000 for something, and this grant will only give you maximum $25,000. Is the cost benefit there for your organization? Another indicator to think about here is the cost share percentage of equity or investment that might be needed. Not all applications require a cost share or equity contribution, but anybody that works in the community opportunity readiness programs, some of those initiatives through the federal government, there has to be an upfront commitment of equity or funding, and that funding has to be used first. If I'm writing a submission, there's often the requirement to have leadership or band administration or the organization's board submit something that says we are committed to put in this amount of money or this percentage of equity. And so we've got to collect that documentation. And maybe that percentage or that funding isn't available. Maybe it's not a fit for that reason. The other thing to consider is more and more we're seeing that proposals come with an application and an application guide. But if there is no application form, you need to develop your own. And a good example there is the Aboriginal Health Human Resource Initiative puts out a call for proposals every year, but they don't have a form for it. And so developing your own from the guide is really important, or from their criteria, so that you have an outline to follow. The next thing is to develop that outline or project plan, either from the application or from your needs and the application guide. The important thing to remember here is, in developing your outline or project plan, mirror back to the funding agency what they are looking for, making sure that you're matching your needs to what they're saying they're looking to fund. In as many cases as possible, use the same terminology that the funding agency is using in the call for proposals or in their guide, and be specific in how you will meet the objectives of that particular grant or call for proposals. So mirroring back is really important, so that you're using the funding agency's terminology and addressing it based on your needs. Number 6 in the 12-step process is to create your own checklist of required information from that grant application or the guide. And I had listed earlier a number of things that could be needed: prior year's audits, a commitment from the funding of equity from the funding agency, the last strategic plan, your comprehensive community plan. So being able to gather all of those core documents together, either electronically or in hard copy, so that you've got them for submission at that 11th hour when you're pulling this all together. Determine if you need collaborators or partnerships. More and more of the calls for proposals are asking to prove who your collaborators and partners are. Again, they're not wanting to see one-off submissions. They want to see that you're working with other entities. So as was said in the preamble by Michelle, I do have a strong municipal background, and we often work with something called the Targeted Sector Support Grant, which is also an eligible grant for First Nations to work with municipalities and vice versa. This is one where you have to have letters or resolutions of support from your partners to be able to even apply for this. A single organization on its own cannot apply. So who do you need those letters of support from? And is it a letter of support? Is it a band council resolution? Is it a tribal council resolution? What is it that the funders need to show or to document who your collaborators and partners are? Because that could be one of the eligibility criteria right off the bat. And there's nothing worse than having a December 31st submission due, and on December 22nd, when all the band offices and tribal councils are maybe shutting down, you realize you're going to need a resolution of support. So knowing that up front is really, really important, and factoring that into your timelines. Talking to a program officer or contact person for that funding agency shouldn't be underestimated. If you attend my one-day training program, you've probably heard the story that I told about the most embarrassing moment in writing a very extensive proposal and having it declined by the funding agency because there was a step that I missed, and that was talking to the program officer for that project with the funding agency. Of course, I was going to fast track it and skip that step. And it turned out that the application was not eligible because we had failed to do that. So talk about one of life's most embarrassing moments. The benefit to talking to the program officer or a contact person for the funding is that some of them will willingly coach you and instruct you along the way. They may even sit on the adjudication committee for that application, so they can be your champion at that decision table. And they will understand more about what you're trying to accomplish and be able to speak on your behalf. Some organizations are now offering information webinars and seminars about their funding. in advance of completing the application. So if you have an opportunity to attend those, I would certainly encourage it. Often these program officers and contacts will have more detailed information for you about what they are looking for in the submission that is going to help increase your chances of success. And I guess just most importantly, keeping that communication open with the funding organization is vitally important in many cases. So now we're on step 9 of a 12-step process, and we haven't started writing yet. So that's really important when we get to the summary, to think about all of this prep, all of this planning is so vitally important before you sit down and start writing. Because you're going to find that if you sit down and start writing without doing this prep and planning, you're going to end up scurrying around at the end trying to find this documentation and the things that you need, and you may well not be able to get it all together. So I can't say enough about putting the elements of planning into this to get to step 9, and that is starting the writing. So whether you're using an application form that the funder has provided or you've developed your own, there is always a narrative component. If you are working on a portal-based or an online application form, is there a maximum number of words allowed in each section? Is that page or that application going to time out on you? Knowing that from the proposal guide is really, really important because sometimes there is only a certain amount of time, and it's so important then to have things written out in advance so that you can type it in. I know I've had the experience of starting to type away on things like, tell us about your organization, and then all of a sudden it's not capturing your words anymore because you've used too many words. So being aware of that at the front end. If this application form requires an executive summary, leave it to the end, mostly because our thinking can change along the way, and it's much easier to summarize what's in our proposal after we've completed it than putting it in at the beginning and then trying to make the proposal match the executive summary. Don't underestimate the importance of your title page if you're developing your own submission. I can't tell you the number of times that I've been adjudicating applications only to find that you don't know who's really submitted it. Maybe it's come in by email. It doesn't have a clear name as to who's submitting it, what organization it's from, when was it received or submitted. So make sure that if you're doing a title page that you include, the name of your submitting organization right up front, who's your contact person, address, phone, fax, email. If the funder is wanting your business number, making sure you've got that. That is not always readily available to people writing proposals. It may be something you have to get from your finance department, but it could be something that doesn't allow you to proceed further with your application if it's online, if you don't have your business number, or even a charitable number if you have to have charitable status. And bare minimum, a lot of times you need to know your band number. And you may have a 3-digit band number and it requires 4 digits. My lesson learned there is you put a 0 in front of the number to get to your 4 digits, or if you have a 2-digit, 2 zeros. But things like that can really take a lot of your time if you don't know that up front. So having a really good submission title page with all of those indicators on there is vitally important. Then moving into your narrative, your project description. This is fairly generic, but what is your project? How did you determine your need? What is your goal in defining this proposal? What are your objectives? And I think most importantly, what are those key activities that this funding is going to be used for? And with each key activity, what's the timeline that you're doing? And the timeline, and I think I have a slide on that later on, but that can be broken down into weekly, monthly, quarterly, or if it's a multi-year, even annual timelines for each of the key activities. What are the deliverables from the project if it's approved? Are you going to have a policy? Is the policy going to be the deliverable? Is a plan going to be the deliverable? Are you going to have developed and delivered suicide intervention training to 400 youth and across so many different communities? But really knowing what those deliverables are for the project, and then what are the outcomes or indicators of success? If I use the NAPSIS or youth suicide intervention proposals, do you hope to reduce the incidence of self-harm in our communities by, 90%? How are you going to document and track that? But really focusing in on what are those indicators of success going to look like, and making sure that it's something that you're tracking and able to report on. I'm going to go into this a little bit more, but there is always going to be the requirement when you're writing for some type of a budget. And there may be in the application a very, one box that says, what is your budget for this? But then there might be an Excel spreadsheet that is also required that breaks down how they want to see the budget, all the revenues, the expenditures, and what does that look like? And I have a slide further on that. One thing to remember here about the budget is, can you stack funding from multiple federal or federal, provincial, municipal sources? It will say right in the eligibility criteria section about whether you can stack funding. And all that means is, can you use a portion of the funding for this element of the project and another source of funding for another element of the same project? More and more, we're seeing that you can stack funding and even federal funding, but in some cases you can't. The funding you're applying for is only from one source, only from one project, and you're going to have to fit your budget to meet that criteria. And then I talked already about the letters of support and recommendation. The letters of support, mean who else is supporting, who might you be collaborating with. The letter of recommendation might purely be a council resolution that says we're agreeing as the leadership group to submit this application. And a good example there is Jordan's principal applications. If you're submitting a group or even an individual application under Jordan's principle, there is a requirement to submit not just a letter of support and recommendation from a professional, but also something saying that chief and council are willing to accept this funding in their funding agreement. So basically they're saying, yes, we're agreeing to this up front. And the last part is that evaluation plan that I mentioned earlier. How are you going to document and track in this submission your evaluation criteria? And that could be as simple as measuring how many youth attend a session if it's on suicide prevention, or how many communities are going to be engaged. It doesn't have to be anything extensive, but thinking and putting in writing now in the narrative how you're going to evaluate your proposal. The next step, and equally important to the narrative in writing section step 9, is developing that detailed budget. Know the maximum allowable funding and do not exceed it. I remember getting a call from a chief at the end of February saying, we have 48 hours to put in a submission and it can't be 1 cent over $250,000. So make it $249,999. Well, I think I was a little bit more lenient than that, but If that's the maximum allowable amount, do not exceed it. And make sure that if there's in-kind contributions, that that's included in that maximum allowable. Because when the numbers are put together, it may cause you to exceed that amount. You will have to state your revenue from all sources. So if you are intending to stack this, then what are the revenue contributions from other sources? And are they known? Or is it another application that's out there that you don't know the status of yet? Then you detail your expenditures and ensure that all of the elements of your expenditures are eligible expenses. So if you're intending to pay honoraria to elders, for example, for something, is honoraria an eligible expense? If you're intending to hire someone, are wages and benefits an eligible expense? Sometimes you can get around that by saying, yeah, we need a coordinator, but we're going to contract them. So it's going to be contract fees, not salary and benefits. If you are putting in contract fees or salary and benefits for someone to coordinate it, know your formula. And I mean your formula, nobody else's. So if you're putting in $20 an hour for so many hours, for so many weeks, for so many months and years, make sure you know what formula you've put in there. And equally important is the benefits. Is your organization running at 17 to 25% of salary is what your benefits are that they're paying workers right now? So know that up front and make sure that that you're not just guessing at that. And if you are using working papers or post-it notes or whatever, keep those, because I can guarantee you that 3 to 6 months down the road, when this gets funded, you're not going to remember how you came up with those numbers in there if you don't have your working papers. You also may be required for your budget to submit quotes for certain items. So quotes don't just happen overnight as well. So knowing that at the front end with the planning, do we need quotes for tables and chairs for our community hall to support it being used as an elders gathering facility? And that's an example that I've used under New Horizons for Seniors program, where a community redeveloped their community hall certain days of the week for an elders gathering center. So we needed quotes, tables, chairs, stove, fridges. You need to have actual quotes from a furniture distributor or a store that provides that. Sometimes we can get them online, but sometimes we also need to depend on those relationships with local suppliers and vendors to get us those quotes. And then at the end of it all, unless it's all online and you've got an Excel spreadsheet that tabulates things, make sure you check your math. And even if you are using an Excel spreadsheet, that does not mean that the formulas in there are correct. And we've experienced that with Jordan's principle, Excel spreadsheets, where sometimes things don't add up the way they should. So it never hurts to dig out the calculator and check your math to make sure that it jives with your funding request, and knowing what that bottom line is and that it doesn't exceed the maximum allowable amount. Step number 11 goes back to that writing piece. So when you're writing, be clear and effective with your words. So, be explicit. We need to remember that the reader and the adjudication body of these funding applications and proposals may not know anything about you or your organization. I know those of you that are on this webinar are spread across Canada. If I use a Saskatchewan-based example, we may be submitting to a funding agency in Eastern Canada. They may know nothing about Saskatchewan or the organization that we represent. So be as clear and explicit as you can, not only about your organization, but about your need. Describe the significance of your proposed activity. Why is it important to your community? Tug at the heartstrings. Make sure that if if they're putting out a call for proposals to reduce self-harm in communities, that we can really give them some good ideas about why this needs to be funded and why it's important to the impact and the life of the people in your community. Avoid jargon and write out acronyms. Again, the reader may not be from the same school that we're from in terms of the jargon and the terminology we're using. So make sure it's common. And if we're using acronyms, which we're so good at with the federal government and First Nations, write that out at the beginning at least once so that the reader knows if you're using an acronym like PAGC, Prince Albert Grand Council, that it's written out at least in the beginning and that they know what you're talking about. So often our proposals are filled with these acronyms to be able to reduce the number of words, and the reader is left to be scratching their head about who you're talking about or what you're talking about. A good rule of thumb is to write to a grade 6 level. If we think back to when we were in grade 6 and what we were taught then, it's using simple, non-complicated language to get to the point. And step 12 is really that final step before submitting your proposal or application. Never underestimate the importance of proofreading and editing it. And if you've been the writer and you have spent hours and hours and hours on this, you may not see the typos or the grammar that need to be corrected. So if at all possible, have another person proofread it from the perspective of the funding agency would even be of more benefit. So they're looking at content, not just spelling, grammar, formatting, things of that nature. Know who is authorized to sign off and submit the application. And in these days of electronic signatures and things of that nature, it may not be you that has the authority to do this. And I've more than once had to track down chiefs at the 11th hour to say, this has to be submitted through your email to this portal, and it requires your signature. So the earlier on we can engage those signing authorities, the better, so that they know, hey, this is coming. I can expect an email that I need to sign off on or a document that I have to physically sign. That checklist that you developed early on in this 12-step process, go back to that. Some applications even have the checklist built in to the transmittal document, where you physically have to check off that you have submitted this, submitted that, and that you've got all the required documentation. I would say it's safe to say if you haven't ticked all the boxes, you probably go into the ineligible pile. So make sure that you've got all of those documents and that you are attaching them in whatever form they need. There's nothing more frustrating to find out that you have a document in a certain format and it can't be submitted in that format. So then how do you get it into the format that you can attach it as a supporting document? And then meeting the deadline is, I cannot reiterate that enough in terms of knowing what that deadline is in your own time zone and making sure that you are ahead of that deadline in case you encounter any glitches at the 11th hour. So that very quickly is the 12-step process here to, developing and delivering a proposal or grant application. I would like to say that we breathe a sigh of relief when we've pressed that send button or we've got that documentation put together for the application and we send it off in snail mail. But really, sometimes that's only when the work begins. So just a few best and key practices to keep in mind before we close off here. Always retain a copy of the application package, even if you have to take a picture of each page of your electronic submission. I think the electronic submissions have gotten a little bit better at the end where they allow you to keep a copy, but not all of them do. So sometimes when you get to the end of one page and you want to go to the next, take a picture on your phone because at the end you may not have that capacity and you're left trying to remember what you did. And believe me, when you submit at the end and you haven't kept a copy, the funding agency will not give it to you back. We have asked more than once where we've been in haste sending an application and say, can you send us a copy back? Maybe the staff have changed or whatever. You never get it. So the onus is always on the one submitting to keep a copy. Make a file of all the information that you collected along the way, including those working papers that we talked about, whether it be for the budget, any research you had to do, how you came about with, the About Us from your website or whatever. What data did you use? Did you have a needs assessment that you submitted that determined the need for this funding? And certainly if you're keeping hard copies, keep a hard copy of that grant application and those letters or resolutions of support. A good practice is also to develop a spreadsheet of any grants, proposals, and applications that you've been responsible for. We are asked to do that in our organization. I have done it as a band manager and a health director, because at some point your leadership want to know, well, did you submit for that? What did you submit for? So keep your own spreadsheet of what you've done to access funding for your organization to meet the needs that you've been asked to meet. So what agency did you submit to? What was the grant? What was it? What was the amount for? When did you submit it? When was it acknowledged? Sometimes we believe these just go into cyberspace and we never get any acknowledgement, but we do. And if you weren't the contact person listed, but you're the submitter, you aren't going to be the one getting that acknowledgement back. So keeping that contact with whoever is the main contact person, even though it may not be the proposal writer. Is there a date that your grant application was approved, or was it rejected? Keeping track of that. And then very importantly, understanding the amount of the approval, because very seldom was it the amount that you applied for. So there may be things that were ineligible. There may be things that the funding agency says, we're not going to fund that, but here is what we will fund. So your $25,000 application may come in at 20. So really understanding what that approval is. And for those applications or proposals where you are receiving a grant, it's really important that this is where the real work begins. Developing an implementation plan based on what you propose to do in the application or proposal. If you've had a staff turnover, or if the person that is receiving the approval isn't the one that wrote the grant application, who's going to be responsible for implementing? Maybe you have a grant writer or a proposal writer in your organization, but they're not the ones that are going to implement it. So who is going to? I've seen more than one grant that has had to be turned back because nobody was responsible for the implementation, but the agency did get a funding approval, may or may not have received the funding because there wasn't an implementation. Review the details of the approval so you know what they're saying is eligible and what isn't. Communicate that to the key stakeholders, whether it be your board, your council, very importantly, your finance department. All of a sudden they get a check in the mail and they're saying, what's this for? Who's this funding agency? Making sure that it's documented in finance so that the audit requirements are also met. Informing your partners if you had to have letters of support or equity contributions that, yeah, this is coming through so that they can budget for that. Making sure you know what's in that funding agreement once it's been approved for reporting requirements. It may not just be, we're going to get this report done or get this proposal delivered or this project, and then we'll do the follow-up report. There may be progress reporting dates that are tied to how the funding is distributed out to you. So making sure that there's responsibility assigned for that. And then if there's an evaluation component at the end, making sure at the front end you are tracking those things that you're going to have to report on at the end as to evaluation pieces. How many people attended? How many sessions? What were the outcomes that you said you and deliverables, and how are you going to track that? So just in summary here, some key practices, be prepared. Some of these calls for proposals or requests for proposals come out at the same time every year, particularly with Indigenous Services Canada and some with the province. So, get to know roughly when those come out so that you're prepared for those. Know who's authorized to submit a proposal or an application. Some communities and tribal councils, it's very clear that everything has to be vetted through them as a leadership group or through senior management to make sure it fits with the overall vision. And be aware, if there are reporting requirements not met from previous years, your organization is still accountable and you may not be eligible for funding. It doesn't cut it to say to the funding agency, well, I wasn't here 10 years ago when that was due. I know as a co-manager that we have had to reconstruct reporting requirements up to 10 years back, if not more, just to be eligible for future funding. So in terms of summary for your proposal writing practices, investigate, always match your community need with the funding and eligibility criteria that are out there from funding agencies. Plan ahead, allow sufficient time to get your application done and collect that information. When you get to writing, remember, step 9 of the process, put those thoughts to paper, develop your outline or your template, and then start inputting it electronically or into the application form. Have someone review and edit it for quality control, and then submit. And again, know those portals and submission processes and levels of authority for that. Be aware of these electronic portals timing out and the deadline for submissions and retaining that copy. So there in my 50 minutes less one, I think, is proposal and grant writing in a nutshell. So I do open it up, Michelle, to any questions that have come in on chat or to anyone that might have a question.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sherry. You covered a lot of ground, very thorough, very helpful information, especially what is normally a one-day workshop. You captured it in 50 minutes. In the chat box, we have Joan. So when we were back on, I think, number 9, when you're talking about the budget. So what would in-kind be in the maximum allowable? And then can you use in-kind as part of your equity percentage?
It depends on the grant and the funding organization. Yes, in many cases you can. An in-kind contribution might be that you're covering the salary of someone that's going to project manage this, but you often have to put a dollar figure with that, and you have to be aware that that dollar figure might go to the maximum amount allowable, and if it doesn't, it could put you over. So just repeat the question again so that make sure I've covered everything.
So, and let me just pull it up here again. So why would in-kind be in the maximum allowable? And then can you use in-kind as part of your equity percentage?
Okay. So I think I answered the last part first, but I don't have an answer as to why. I just have a School of Hard Knocks experience where we entered the in-kind to show that, we had skin in the game. And when they did the calculations, they took the in-kind contribution and said, you're ineligible because the maximum allowable is this amount. I can't answer for that funding agency, but it was certainly something I became aware of for the first time.
Okay, great. That is the hour. So I want to make note, I believe it was Caitlin, if back in the chat, she had mentioned, so if this is of interest, May 2024, there's a conference in which Sherry also will be delivering this presentation, I'm going to guess. So if that's of interest, if you were to check out the chat box, maybe Caitlin, do you want to put your information in the chat box again? If anyone is interested in attending this conference, and is there a cost for this conference to attend? And I believe I read it said it was in Saskatchewan as well. So Caitlin, if you can put some more information, or if you're interested, you can just scroll up and you should be able to see the information that Caitlin had provided. I think she also, I don't know why my scroller isn't working right now. Oh, there it is. So there you go, everybody. So if you're interested, this was a great presentation, very helpful. And so that is an opportunity for you to, in next spring, if you were interested to learn a little bit more to build that capacity. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. So this was a recorded session. So in the event you feel like you want to watch it again, or if you feel like there's somebody in your organization who could benefit from listening to this, that this is a great resource that's going to be on Candu's website. I also am wondering, Sherry, are you going to share your PowerPoint?
I hadn't thought about that. Probably not, because this is the basis for the one-day seminar as well. Where the benefit of the one-day seminar is that it's participatory and we get to hear from other people, their best practices, their school of hard knocks, and go from there. So that's
No
the benefit
problem.
of.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Sherry, for being here. And I hope everybody has a good rest of the day. Remember, Grandmother Moon, she's out, I believe, 9:37 East Mountain Standard Time anyways. So have a good rest of the day, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. So be well.
Thank you, everyone.